Welcome to the deep dive. If you're like us, you're probably trying to cut through all the noise on these really complex situations and, get to the core of what's really going on.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're aiming for today. We've got this stack of sources that you've provided, and we're going to explore this unfolding story.
We're really going to try and dig into the layers here.
Definitely. Everything from the sort of immediate news hitting the wire to the really critical humanitarian work that happens kind of behind the scenes.
And even some less official stuff, right? Like online discussions.
Exactly. Some surprising corners of the information landscape touching on unexpected aspects of the conflict.
Okay, so the big picture we're diving into today, it's these reports of a massive prisoner swap between Ukraine and Russia, and everything swirling around that.
Mm-hmm. And for this deep dive, we've looked at quite a range. We've got news reports from UPI, Newsweek, the BBC, TRT Global, RBC Ukraine. And we've also looked at a discussion thread over on Reddit. And really importantly, insights from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC.
Right. So our mission, basically, is to figure out what these sources tell us about this reported swap. Where does it stand?
Understand the different perspectives because they're not all saying the same thing.
And really grasp the vital role these neutral groups play, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just see what these diverse sources reveal about the bigger conflict and the conversations it sparks. Okay, let's jump in.
All right.
Okay, so the most striking news, the thing that really jumps out from our sources, it concerns this potentially huge prisoner exchange.
Right. We're seeing multiple Ukrainian officials, plus news outlets like Radio Free, Europe Radio Liberty, the Kyiv Independent, CNN, UPI, RBC Ukraine. They're all reporting it.
And what are they reporting exactly?
That a large-scale prisoner swap is actually underway as of Friday, May 23rd, 2025. And the numbers are big. We're talking 1,000 prisoners from each side.
1,000 each. Wow. And the sources, they make it clear this isn't like a quick thing, right? Not over in a day.
No, exactly. It's reported as a process. It's ongoing, expected to take several days to actually complete.
Okay, 1,000 for 1,000. That's a massive number. And how did this even come about?
Well, what's significant is how the agreement happened. The sources point to direct talks. In Istanbul, just last week, around May 16th.
Direct talks.
Yeah, and what struck me reading this is that it was apparently the first time the two sides had met face-to-face for direct negotiations in, 3 years.
3 years. Wow, that gap is definitely notable. And President Zelensky commented on this.
He did via social media just recently, May 22nd. It was reported on the 23rd in our sources. He called the prisoner swap, and I quote, perhaps the only tangible result of the meeting in Turkey.
The only tangible result.
Yeah, and he added that Ukraine is actively working to make sure it happens. Clarifying details for every single person on those lists.
And he'd mentioned it before that too, right?
Yeah, actually, earlier. On Monday the 19th, it was reported he called the 1,000 for 1,000 agreement the most significant outcome of those Istanbul meetings.
So clearly a priority for Ukraine.
Absolutely. He was quoted saying, returning all of our people from Russian captivity is one of Ukraine's key objectives. Makes sense.
And the timeline. It seems like things moved pretty quickly after those talks.
It looks like it. The sources suggest the actual swapping of names, the lists, happened on May 22nd. So right before the exchange itself was expected to kick off in stages.
Okay, now, here's where it gets a little tricky, maybe, depending on which source you're looking at.
Right, because while Ukrainian officials and major news outlets, UPI, CNN, they're reporting the swap is underway but not yet completed.
Yeah, and one source familiar with it even told the Kyiv Independent it was definitely still ongoing.
But then there's a completely different take.
Yes, we have this post from former U.S. President Donald Trump on his Truth Social account, Friday morning, May 23rd.
And what did he say?
He claimed, quite directly, that a major prisoners swap was just completed between Russia and Ukraine. It will go into effect shortly.
Completed. That's a pretty direct contradiction to the other reports, isn't it?
It is. And he even added, congratulations to both sides on this negotiation. This could lead to something big, with the question marks.
Huh. It really highlights how information around something this sensitive can just vary wildly, depending on the source, maybe the message they want to send.
It certainly seems that way. Just to put this, potential 1,000 for 1,000 swap into some context.
Yeah, how does it compare to previous ones?
Well, the sources mention others, generally smaller. UPI's related articles talk about a swap of 230 POWs.
Okay.
And the BBC source, it goes into quite a bit of detail about a pretty significant exchange back on December 30th, 2024. That one was brokered by the UAE.
Oh, the UAE. Right. How many were involved there?
In that one, Russia said they swapped 150 Ukrainian soldiers for 150 of their own troops. Ukraine actually reported a slightly higher number coming back to their side, 189 people.
And they highlighted specific groups.
They did. They mentioned defenders of Azovstal and Mariupol, plus personnel from Chernobyl and Snake Island. So some very symbolic locations.
And the BBC, how did they frame that December swap?
They noted it was the 59th exchange since the full-scale invasion started, and they called it one of the biggest so far.
Okay, so that comparison really underlines the scale of this potential 1,000 for 1,000 swap. It would be, well, way bigger.
Significantly larger, yeah.
Yeah.
But the BBC source also added something interesting.
What's that?
That negotiations for these exchanges have reportedly gotten more difficult in recent months.
Which makes achieving an agreement for this huge one now even more striking, maybe.
Exactly. And sources like TRT Global and RBC Ukraine, they specifically link this 1,000 for 1,000 deal back to those Istanbul talks.
The ones Turkey facilitated.
Right. The first direct talks in 3 years. And reportedly, Turkey actually proposed this prisoner exchange when other parts of the discussion hit a dead end.
Ah, so maybe a way to get something moving. And what's Ukraine's position on the timing, linking it to future talks?
Interesting point. TRT Global reported, citing President Zelensky, that Ukraine believes this 1,000 for 1,000 exchange needs to be fully done, fully implemented, before they even decide on a place for any future direct talks.
So it's like a precondition almost.
Yeah.
Okay. If we kind of zoom out now, look at the broader diplomatic picture, what else are the sources saying?
Well, Newsweek brings up former President Trump again. His stated interest in brokering peace, his frustration that things haven't progressed.
And that call with Putin.
Yeah, a recent call. Newsweek and TRT Global mention a Wall Street Journal report about it. Now, the Kremlin disputes this account.
Okay, important caveat.
But the report claimed Putin told Trump he's basically not ready to end the conflict because he thinks he's winning.
What's Russia's public stance then, according to these sources?
Newsweek says Russia states they're open to talking about a ceasefire, that they want peace, but they see complexities. And they suggest maybe Ukraine would just use any pause to regroup and rearm.
And Ukraine's view on that?
Predictably different. They see Russia's reluctance for an immediate ceasefire as evidence they don't really want peace right now. Ukraine suggests more pressure is needed.
So it feels like, even with this potential movement on the prisoner swap, this big humanitarian gesture, the fundamental positions on actually ending the war seem, well, pretty far apart based on these reports anyway.
That seems fair to say. Which brings up a really crucial point, doesn't it?
How do these things even happen? How do exchanges like this or any humanitarian aid get done when the politics are stuck and the fighting's ongoing?
Exactly. And this is where the sources bring in the vital, often kind of quiet role of neutral intermediaries. Specifically, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the ICRC.
Ah, the ICRC. Their source must be quite revealing.
It really is. It explains their whole approach. They talk about their core principles: neutral, impartial, independent. You know, they've been operating this way for over 160 years.
And they explain why neutrality is so important to them.
They do, very clearly. They actually call it the most pragmatic approach that allows us to help the most people. Pragmatic. I like that.
Yeah, it's not just idealism. So what's the logic?
Their reasoning is, basically, by not taking sides publicly, not judging who's right or wrong, they can keep talking to warring parties on both sides.
Okay, maintain dialogue.
Yeah, and they believe this builds the trust they need to operate, to act for the benefit of civilians and prisoners of war without bias.
It makes a lot of sense, actually, if you start denouncing one side publicly.
Exactly. They say that by not doing that, warring parties are more inclined to open doors that remain closed for others, which generally gives the ICRC the widest possible access, both to the victims and to the groups involved in the fighting.
Doors others can't open. That's powerful.
It is, and they're realistic, you know. They admit neutrality doesn't always work perfectly, but their experience over all those years shows it works best for achieving their humanitarian aims.
And what kind of activities does this neutrality actually enable on the ground?
A whole range. Delivering aid, reuniting families split by war, helping POWs get home.
Like this potential swap.
Precisely. Implementing humanitarian agreements, facilitating safe passage for civilians, protecting detainees, all that critical stuff.
Do they give specific examples?
Loads of them. The ICRC source mentions examples from all over the world, including specifically the Russia-Ukraine conflict, showing neutrality in action.
Such as?
Well, facilitating prisoner releases and exchanges, not just potentially here, but they did it in Yemen, Colombia, Sudan, Mali, Senegal.
Okay.
And crucially, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict since 2022, they say they visited thousands of POWs on both sides. And, get this, managed to share nearly 13,000 personal messages between those POWs and their families.
13,000 messages. Wow. Just imagine getting one of those if your loved one was captive. That's incredibly important work.
Absolutely vital. And it's not just POWs. Reuniting families, dealing with missing persons they've worked on that in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, historically Iran, Iraq.
And in this conflict?
For Russia-Ukraine, they say they've given news to over 12,500 families looking for loved ones. Though they also note, tragically, tens of thousands more are still waiting for answers.
God, the scale is just immense. What about evacuations and aid?
Neutrality helps there, too. They give examples. Israel and the occupied territories, Syria, Sudan, they evacuated an orphanage from Khartoum. Afghanistan.
And Ukraine.
Yeah, early in the full-scale conflict, they facilitated safe passage out of Mariupol, including from the Azovstal plant, remember that?
I do, yeah.
And help people cross the international borders.
It really makes a powerful case for why you need these genuinely neutral actors in a war zone, doesn't it? Even when the politics are completely gridlocked.
Totally. As the ICRC puts it, and this quote really stuck with me, we talk to everybody so that we can serve the needs of people on all sides of the front line.
Talk to everybody. Okay. Shifting gears just a little, the sources also gave us other glimpses, right, into the human impact, maybe some less conventional aspects of the conflict.
Yeah, beyond just the big swap news. For instance, that UPI source from May 20th, it included a report that Ukraine's coordination headquarters announced Russia had returned the bodies of 909 Ukrainian soldiers just last week.
909, just a stark reminder of the cost.
A very stark reminder. And going back to that December 2024 swap, the BBC source really captured the emotion of it.
How so?
Describing families waiting, with tears, quoting released prisoners, just expressing overwhelming happiness to be home. Some had been held for over 2.5 years.
2.5 years, yeah.
And many were dealing with serious illnesses or injuries. Just pure relief.
Did we get the Russian perspective on that swap, too?
We did. The Russian Defense Ministry's account noted their 150 returning troops were sent to Belarus first for medical care and to contact family. The Russian Rights Ombudsman also made comments.
But even with these swaps happening, there's a but, isn't there?
A big but. The BBC provides that crucial reminder. Thousands more Ukrainians remain in captivity. The estimates they cite suggest the total is thought to be over 8,000.
8,000 still held. It's just a huge number to keep in mind.
A staggering number.
Okay, and then there was the Reddit source. That gave us a very different kind of angle.
Very different. It focused on a video, apparently showing a captured mercenary, reportedly from Africa.
And what was happening in the video, according to the thread?
The premise described was this captured mercenary saying slogans. Anti-Putin, pro-Ukraine slogans. The person who posted it framed it as educational, informational, documenting reality, not glorifying violence. They put a viewer discretion warning too.
Right. And the comments section, what kind of discussions did that spark?
Oh, it's a real range of reactions. Lots of skepticism, as you'd probably expect, about whether statements made by someone held captive are actually sincere.
Sure, that makes sense. What else?
Well, importantly, it kicked off this whole debate about the legal status of mercenaries. Are they covered by POW status under the Geneva Conventions? Can they claim asylum? People were arguing different interpretations right there in the comments.
Yeah, that's a really complex legal area, isn't it? Because POW status under the Geneva Conventions usually applies to, regular armed forces or organized militias meeting certain criteria.
Exactly.
Mercenaries often fall into a gray area. Are they combatants with protections? Or something else entirely under international law? It depends on the specifics.
Right. It's definitely not straightforward. And that complexity was clearly reflected in the discussion. People also talked about the recruitment of foreign fighters, specifically from Africa, fighting for Russia, and the presence of Africans in Russia generally, with some comments unfortunately mentioning racism. One comment also briefly mentioned reports about Iranian mercenaries maybe entering the conflict.
So it's a good example of how these online spaces can sometimes offer these raw, unfiltered, maybe sometimes unverified perspectives on aspects of the conflict you don't always see in the main headlines.
Absolutely, like the really complex status of foreign fighters, the human stories around that.
Okay, so let's try and pull back, look at everything we've severed from all these different sources. It really paints a a layered picture, doesn't it?
It really does. On one hand, you've got this immediate hopeful news, this potentially huge prisoner swap underway, but then also the confusion about its exact status, depending on where you look.
And we've seen the absolutely vital but often sort of unseen work that neutral humanitarian groups like the ICRC do, making these exchanges and other aid even possible.
And then those glimpses into the very human toll, the return of fallen soldiers' bodies, the raw emotion of prisoners coming home.
But also the ongoing challenge, those thousands still held captive. And even those complex legal and human questions raised online about, say, foreign fighters.
It really underscores how these different pieces, they kind of fit together, the sheer numbers in this potential swap and the thousands still captive that highlights the scale of the human impact.
Right.
The details of the swap process, the stories of returnees that shows the deep personal significance, and the ICRC's role. It demonstrates that even when things look impossible politically, these channels for humanitarian action, built on neutrality, they can sometimes open doors.
Yeah, and just looking across the range of sources really drives home that you need to pay attention to where the information is coming from. Official statements, presidential tweets, news reports, online chats. They all give you different pieces, sometimes contradictory pieces.
Definitely need to read critically.
It is.
It's a lot to take in. Maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener,
Yeah.
to sort of mull over.
Okay.
A huge prisoner swap like this, it's undoubtedly a massive humanitarian positive for the individuals, for the families involved. You could even see it as a potential step maybe towards building some tiny bit of trust.
Maybe.
But as these sources also show us pretty clearly, it's happening within this much larger ongoing conflict where the stated goals, the perceptions of who's winning, they seem really far apart still. And the path to any kind of comprehensive peace looks, well, deeply uncertain.
Yeah.
So the question to think about might be, what does this possibility of such a large swap happening right alongside ongoing fighting and these major diplomatic challenges we've heard about, what does that suggest to you about the current phase of this conflict? And what potential paths forward, if any, does it hint at?
Something to definitely keep thinking about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.